Right guys, so we're just going to take a look at this lens in terms of distortion. I want to see if we've got any barrel distortion, pincushion distortion, vignetting on this lens, and I'll have a look at how it performs on a brick wall as well to see if we're getting good lines in terms of distortion. And then obviously we'll look at the Sigma one, and the Sigma Contemporary, and we'll check that out as well. But for now, let's just have a look at what distortion we get from this lens, and I also want to see how it performs in terms of flaring against the sun. So let's have a look at that, and we'll continue with the reviews. Thank you. Hello everyone, we're doing the lens flare test on the Tamron 150-600 G2. We're at 150mm. I'm just going to test the flaring capabilities of this lens. So we're just going to bring the lens up to the sun and have a look and see if we're getting any flaring going off. I don't see any major flaring, so it looks alright. So let's try this at 300mm next. Right, 300mm, let's see how the flaring does. Bring it up to the sun again. Again, it looks alright. Don't see any major issues with flaring. The optics seem very good. Okay, let's try the same test at 600mm. Just need to bring it up to the sun. See how the flaring is doing. It's not too bad. You can see better in the video than I can, but let me know in the comments what you think about these two lenses. But flaring on both lenses seems to be well controlled. Hello everyone, so we're looking at the Tamron SP 150-600mm F5-6.3 DI-VC USD G2 lens. We're trying to determine distortion in this video and have a look at what's happening with this lens in regards to barrel distortion and pincushion distortion. So we're going to go through various focal lengths. So we're going to be looking at 150mm, 300mm, 400mm, 500mm and 600mm, and we want to try and determine how the lens performs and what results it's given us. So first of all, we're looking at 150mm, and my thoughts would be going to be quite subjective. You may have a different point of view, but looking at the image that's been represented, while it looks quite good, I can see that obviously the corners are a bit on the softer side, but it looks quite sharp in the corners, if I'm honest with you. F6.3. This is on the EOS R full frame camera, so it's a full frame camera that we're looking at the images with. So this is F6.3. Let's see if we've noticed any difference, but I do think there's a tiny bit of barrel distortion at 150mm. So let's look at F8. Slight improvement in the corners, and it just gives us good contrast, but like I said, I do feel like there is a bit of barrel distortion, but not a lot. F16, it does improve the corners slightly, but not by much. Gives us good contrast, and obviously you can see the distortion there for yourself. So let's look at 300mm. So obviously it's quite a way in, 300mm. To my eye, we seem to have a straightening of the distortion here, and I don't think there's any distortion there that can be detected, and I'm not seeing any pincushion distortion. So we're getting a good result. F6.3, everything looks reasonably sharp. I don't see any major problems there. Sharpness looks good. So let's have a look at F8, 300mm. Remember, there is some vignetting going off with this lens. We will address that shortly. So again, looking at this, it looks well represented at F8. Looks good contrast again, no major problems. I don't see anything wrong here. Let's have a look at F16. Again, no major problems. The corners seem to be a lot sharper than there was, so it looks good. Again, no distortion that I can detect. So have a look at 400 millimeters. 400 millimeters. I think there might be a tiny amount of pincushion distortion, but it's very minor, if any at all. Just to my eye, there seems to be a tiny bit, but I think there might only be 1% there. There's very little. At F6.3 looks reasonable. No major problems with any sort of softening. I think there's a bit of softening in the corners, but not much. But that's to be expected with F6.3. So have a look at F8. Brightens up the image a bit. Obviously we do have some vignetting going off, but it certainly does improve sharpness in the corners at F8. So let's just go to F16. Minor improvement in terms of corner sharpness. It seems reasonable, but again, I'm not totally impressed with the Tamron's corners versus the Sigma. I do think the Sigma is a tiny bit sharper in the corners, but it looks quite reasonable, that image does. So let's have a look at 500 millimeters. So this is at 6.3. Pincushion distortion, there's a tiny bit, but I don't see anything there that would concern you in regards to image quality. Corners look well represented. They do seem to be a bit dark in the corners, but it's up to you to make your mind up, obviously. So look at F8. The corners are brightened up significantly, so again, we are still having vignetting issues, but I will address that in a separate segment. But looking at the image contrast, looks well contrast. I do think the corners do look a bit soft, if I'm honest with you still, so I don't think we're getting a vast improvement there. F16, the corners have brightened up a bit, so sharpness has improved in the corners by going down to F16 on full frame. Let's have a look at 600 millimeters at 6.3. So that's F6.3, looks reasonable. Corners do not look greatly sharp, but the center looks quite good. But going back to 500 millimeters at F8, does seem to be a tiny bit sharper than the 6.3 in the center. Go back to 6.3 on 600 millimeters. That's the result that we've got. Let's have a look at F8. It's brightened up again. I don't see any sort of improvement in sharpness in the center at all. It just seems brighter overall because of the vignetting that's going off. Sharpness in the corners is okay. I won't say it's too sharp in the corners. F16 at 600 millimeters, we've gained a bit of sharpness in the corners and a little bit in the center. So that's just a brief look at the various focal lengths, trying to determine some sort of distortions regarding barrel distortion and pincushion distortion. I think this lens suffers more from barrel distortion at the lower end of the focal length, but when it gets to the top end, I think there's very little pincushion distortion. I think there's a tiny bit at 600 millimeters, maybe 2 or 3%, but you're not going to notice it really. And I think there's virtually none at 300 and 400 millimeters at all. So that's the distortion we've been looking at. Just wanted to go through it briefly so you can get an idea on how it performs on straight bricks, because bricks is a good idea because normally they're quite straight. So thank you for looking at this. Let's have a look at vignetting next. So here we're going to look at the APS-C images on the 90D. There's not going to be much distortion. Every focal length I'm quoting, just times it by 1.6 crop factor to give you your true focal length. For example, 600 millimeters becomes 960 millimeters. So without further ado, let's go through the images. I've got 3 apertures at each focal length for you to look at, f6.3, f8 and f16 respectively. In terms of distortion, such as barrow distortion and pincushion distortion. We're not going to see much of that because we're magnifying the centre of the lens. All I can really say to you is that there is minor barrow distortion at 150. It levels itself out at 300, and then we get a tiny bit of pincushion distortion coming in at 500 and 600 millimeters, but it's very minor, hardly noticeable. So let's just have a look at F6.3 at 150, and then let's have a look at F8. Remember, there is a bit of vignetting going off. I will address that in a separate segment because I want to have a look at some white wallpaper. We can have a look at that in that video, but for the time being, let's just focus on what we're doing here. So let's have a look at F16 at 150. There's a bit of sharpness in the corners, it's improved but not much. So let's have a look at 300 millimeters at F6.3, and let's have a look at F8. Tiny improvement in the corners, but very minor. Let's have a look at F16. I don't see any difference really. 300 millimeters. Sorry, I mean 400 millimeters. So that's at F6.3. It's not too sharp, if I'm honest with you. Even in the centre it's not that sharp, so I would certainly recommend that you keep to full frame. The corners look a bit soft as well, so let's have a look at F8. There's minor improvement in the corners, but centre sharpness seems to be the same. Let's have a look at F16. I don't see any improvement really. If anything, I think the corners got a bit softer. Right, let's have a look at 500 at F6.3. Again, the corners don't look too sharp and the centre isn't that sharp either. So let's have a look at F8, see if we have any improvement. I don't see any improvement really, apart from maybe the corners got a tiny bit sharper, but it's almost none. So you know, stopping this lens down ain't going to help you improve on sharpness on APS-C. It may do. I think it is a lot better on full frame, but APS-C I won't even bother. So F16 at 500 millimeters. Again, I don't see any improvement. Sharpness in the corners are not improved either. So let's have a look at 600 millimeters. That's F6.3. So that's 6.3. I do think the lens does improve at 600 versus 500. But make your own mind up on that. Corners are not too sharp. See if F8 improves anything. A tiny bit, but hardly noticeable. So that's F6.3 at 600. That's F8. And then we'll just have a look at F16 at 600. I think the corners sharpen up a tiny bit, but I'm really splitting hairs here, guys. There's very little difference between having it on F6.3 and F8. So those are people out there have said it's not a sharp lens at F6.3. It's actually, it is. It's when you just try stopping it down to F8, there's hardly any difference, if any at all, especially on APS-C. So that's just a quick example of distortion, but again, like I said, my assessment of distortion on the APS-C in particular is we get a tiny bit at 150, levels itself out at 300, and there's minor amounts on 500 and 600 millimeters. There's a tiny bit more on full frame versus APS-C, but it's so minor you probably won't notice it in real world examples. So that's that segment. So thank you for watching. Right, here we're just going to whiz through the vignetting example we got here. The main light source is actually on the left side here, so it may seem a bit dark on the other side, but that's because we're just using one light source. So I'm just going to whiz through the focal length. This is on the EOS R full frame. So we're going to look at the focal lengths and just whiz through basically the examples. There's not much to say, that there is vignetting on this lens, so you just need to be aware of that. Normally stopping down gets rid of that vignetting. You can use Photoshop or Lightroom correction, and I believe you can also do it in camera as well. So without further ado, let's have a look at the vignetting and see how it affects the image. So 150mm at f5, next one is at f5.6, then the next one is f6.3, then the next one is at f8, and finally f16 at 150mm. So let's have a look at 300. This is at 5.6. Let's have a look at f6.3. Then we have f8. Then we have f16. Then we have 500mm. We've just done 300 at f6.3. Then we have f8, then we have f16. So let's just have a look at 600mm. So we're looking at f6.3, then we look at f8, and then we look at f16. So that's how vignetting affects the lens at various focal lengths at various apertures. I hope that was helpful, and let's move on to the APS-C test. So we're just going to assess distortion vignetting on APS-C 90D camera. We're just going to whiz through this. I don't think we need to go through it in much detail. The only thing I will say is that the light source is at this side. We've got a light box at this side, so it may seem a bit darker on the right, but it's just because that's the way the light falls. Also, you need to be made aware that the focal length is increased by 1.6 times. For example, 600mm becomes 960mm, and because all the pixels are crammed in tightly in an APS-C sensor, you'll find that it is extremely taxing on a full frame lens, and that's why sometimes a full frame lens may not be sharp enough if you're using APS-C. Just keep that in mind. So without further ado, let's have a look at the 150mm focal length. So I'm just going to whiz through it really. So aperture f5 is what we've got here. 5.6, 6.3, f8, f16. Then we'll look at 300mm at 5.6, 6.3, f8, f16. Then we'll look at 500mm. This is at 6.3, f8, f16. Then we'll look at 600mm. We are at f6.3, f8, and then finally f16. So there's the results. While I've got you here, as I've mentioned previously, where I feel when we increase the aperture, make the aperture smaller, like f16. Obviously I've done a recent image quality test, but I think when we come down in terms of aperture, we're introducing diffraction, and I just wanted to show you the difference here. So we look at this at f8 at 600mm. It looks reasonably okay. Even 6.3 looks a bit sharper if I'm honest with you. So we come to f8, it just seemed to soften slightly. So if we have a look at f16, and you can tell it's got a lot more blur here. So I think on APS-C it is prone to diffraction quite a lot, and that tends to be softness in your image. So I hope this was helpful, you know, going through the distortion of the Tamron 150 to 600 SP 150 to 600 millimeter F5-6.3 DI-VC USD G2. We will be looking at the Sigma Contemporary shortly, but I hope this was informative and I hope you learned something in this video. Again, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. It helps the algorithm, it helps this video get out there in the YouTube world and helps people find it. So I hope you learned something and have a nice day.